and the Classroom Conference sponsored by the CHS Foundation. We're grateful for the support of the CHS Foundation for their continued support of agricultural literacy. We're also glad that you're with us today. We encourage you to stay for each session, but remember that each session will be recorded and available on our National Ag in the Classroom website in the next week. This is the secondary track, and you can use other link provided to flip back and forth between the elementary and the secondary tracks. During the session today, listeners will be able to submit questions through the Q&A. As your host, I'll relay those questions to the presenter, or you'll be responded to individually. Please follow up with the National Ag in the Classroom later this week as we appreciate your evaluation of the program and how we can continue to support you moving forward into the upcoming school year. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kasey Bozeman. Kasey serves as the 4-H science specialist with the University of Georgia. In her role, she develops lesson plans, curricula, and project-based learning opportunities for 4-H youth in 159 counties across Georgia about science and agriculture. She also presents in-person and virtual professional development for 4-H faculty and staff. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kasey for the next 45 minutes.
Excellent. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Thank you, Michelle, for your kind introduction, and certainly just appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. Good morning or afternoon, or depending on where you're joining us from, the different time zones there. But I'm just honored, excited to share more about these engineering of plants and certainly plant biotechnology with you all. And so I was telling them earlier, I get super dorky and nerd out over all of this stuff. So my intention is for us to have a good time together and hopefully empower you with some new content that you can use with your respective Ag in the Classroom programs. And similarly, throughout this time, if you have questions or concerns, making sure that I address those. I know we can all be reluctant to teach things if we lack that content or perhaps that confidence. And so my goal is just to make your job easier, whatever job or role that you play. And so with that, we're going to dive right on in to our activities. And so just to give you a quick overview of our 45 minutes together, I'm going to talk a little bit about our 4-H at Home project and how this kind of came to be, give you an overview of the 6 different lesson plans that we have written relates to plant biotechnology and selective breeding, and then talk about how we have piloted this project with our summer camping program last year, and then perhaps give you a moment or two to think about how this could be impactful and important in your own work, and then certainly along the way address any questions or concerns. And Michelle's gonna help me keep an eye on the chat box and the Q&A feature and all of that type of stuff. But I'm comfortable with, if you have a question throughout, to throw it in there just so that it can be addressed in real time as opposed to at the end trying to catch up. But do know I'll certainly allocate some time at the end if need be. And so just to start off with, I love plants. I love everything about plants. I love plants that just give us oxygen or cute decor in our home or office. I love plants that help hold the soil in place and prevent erosion. I love plants that give us food. And so plants are really my jam. And one of my favorite quotes that actually hangs in my office here is attributed to Paul Harvey, that despite all of our accomplishment, our existence, to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And so why both that rain and soil is so important, certainly for our food and fiber and just overall health and well-being. So we need that definitely in order for those plants to do for us. And so real quickly, perhaps more personal information that I'm comfortable sharing, even though it just makes me look more like a nerd, is that early on during that kind of work from home period in 2020, I was actually working with a group of professors on campus to do some outreach programming for our 4-H youth. And many of you may be familiar with the 4-H program itself. And so we operate in every state across the nation through various land grant universities. And this programming kind of looks different in each state, or sometimes even in each community. We're all about meeting the needs of young people, traditionally culture, but really this modern age of focusing on giving young people the ability to develop their life skills, and through various content areas such as agriculture, science, healthy living, civic, and a variety of others. And so as we were doing some of this outreach programming with young people early in 2020, all virtually, of course, I had a geneticist who works at UGA talk to the students about what he does. And so he breeds plants, breeds tomatoes specifically. Tomato breeder was definitely not a career option at career day growing up. And if it was, I probably would have chosen that because tomatoes are awesome and breeding them would probably be a lot of fun as well. And so within his discussion, though, he talked about this wild mustard plant. And so its scientific name, you can see there, Brassica oleracea. And wild mustard has been around prehistoric times, growing. It is, in fact, that mustard seed where we get that tangy yellow stuff we put on our hot dogs. All of that's associated with this plant. But beyond the seed, and sometimes folks eat mustard greens, but they're generally not very tasty, kind of have a little bit of bitterness to them. And so not a plant that's very useful for humans. But literally over hundreds and hundreds of years, the wild mustard plant has been selectively bred to give us different cultivars, or simply cultivated varieties. If we smush those two words together, that's where we get that word cultivar. And so many of the plants that we see in the grocery store, and maybe they're on our dinner plate, that were very common to us, things like kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those are cultivars or cultivated varieties of Brassica oleracea. So what's really cool is that we have taken this wild mustard plant. It is all that same species, but over again, hundreds and hundreds of years, it's been selectively bred for certain characteristics. And you can kind of see there quickly if we're looking at the leaf buds, or perhaps the a long stem for kohlrabi, or the flower buds, or things like that, to get these various plants. So they all look very different. Of course, Brussels sprouts looks very different than something like cauliflower, but this is all the same variety, this wild mustard, this Brassica oleracea. And none of those cultivars, so the kale, the cabbage, all the way down, none of those actually naturally occur in the wild, because we have had farmers and scientists work together to selectively breed. And so I will tell you, as a grown adult, when I learned this, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. Who knew? And a lot of times when I do presentations about these lesson plans, I kind of ask the same thing. And sometimes people know, but a lot of times people are like, what do you mean cabbage doesn't just naturally occur in the wild? It doesn't. Wild mustard does. And so that kind of parent species, if you will, but cabbage isn't going to just be naturally found. And that's because it is this derivative, this selectively bred cultivar. So I found this fascinating. And I'm sure all of us during the pandemic picked up some new hobby, right? Folks were trying, baking bread, and different new exercise routines, or some sort of, quilting project. My hobby was learning more about plants, super dorky, but that's okay. And so I was like, anything I could read or learn more about plant breeding, and particular this Brassica oleracea, I was like, I'm in. And so because of that, that kind of gives you just a little bit, again, probably more personal knowledge than you care to know, but gives you a little bit of the history of how this kind of became about. And so we, as the University of Georgia and Georgia 4-H, worked with the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, and within the USDA, their division called AFRI, the Agriculture Food Research Initiative, and had some funding to develop lesson plans aligned to one of their priorities. So we actually looked at plant health and production and plant products, the PHPPP for short. You know, any organization loves some acronyms. And if I had to say PHPPP all day long, it would probably be a little difficult. Maybe it starts to roll off the tongue after a while, but aligning it with their grant or their mission rather, to increase knowledge of plant systems and the various factors that affect agriculture plant productivity. And so with this, today we're going to talk a little bit more about those lessons and of course, how to utilize them, specifically designed for middle school students. And of course, we know as educators, we could do some modifications and scaffolding. If we wanted to use it with upper elementary, perhaps we could. Definitely there's some ways to take it to that more advanced high school level. And we're actually in the process of developing some more things in-house to align with this, and love to connect with you offline if that may be something you're interested in as well. So with that, why are plants important, and why, you know, why this project? And again, going back to the USDA as the funder, and how does this all play a part of what we do? Because we all know we're in the trenches every day and understand the importance of educating about agriculture, so that our young people and in turn, hopefully their families, better know where their food and fiber comes from. So plants supply about 90% of the calories we consume as humans, and then about 80% of the protein, which kind of helps me in some way, because I always think protein, you think of like animal products, you think of like the beans and you know, that kind of food group. But if you think about it, there is a lot of protein that we do get from plant material, and certainly those animal products. So you think of, again, the meats that we eat, of course, have a lot of protein in them, but those animals, of course, have to have plants in order for them to be able to live. So we think back to the food chain. So collectively, plants are very much a part of our food systems, and certainly know where our food is coming from. And then when we think about plant biotechnology, and I use that kind of as the big general term of what we're focusing on today. And essentially we are looking for any type of genetic manipulation of plants that make those plants more beneficial or useful for us. And so whether that benefit or use is to increase higher yields, maybe using something like less water, maybe the growth time is a little bit faster. Maybe it's making that plant less or more resistant rather, or less susceptible to certain diseases or pests or things like that. Maybe it makes things taste a little bit better, and so giving us more nutrition, or making something taste a little bit tastier, so that more folks choose to eat it. So regardless of why we're doing some sort of genetic manipulation, big pictures, that's kind of what plant biotechnology is all about. And we'll talk here in a few about you know, what necessarily does genetically modified mean. We see that word GMOs, a lot of times it has a negative connotation with it, and certainly wanting to better educate. So I choose to kind of use plant biotechnology as that big umbrella of essentially we're just changing around some of those plant genetics, and we do it in a couple different ways. Something that's really important to know, you think about overall production of various crops, commodities here in the United States. The majority of all of our corn, soybeans, and cotton, three very large commodities that have huge yields, all are grown using some sort of plant biotechnology, which is important to understand that this is not something that we just created in a lab yesterday, or it's very modern, perhaps. It's literally been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so when we think about plant biotechnology, the big picture, if we're going to kind of think about how that happens, one of those is something like selective breeding. And so that's really what our lessons are focusing on today. And that's how that wild mustard, that Brassica oleracea, has been through that selective breeding process. It's something that certainly doesn't happen overnight by any means, but it is through hundreds and hundreds of years of different generations of that particular plant. So selective breeding simply means we as humans, whether we're that farmer in the field, whether we're that scientist in the lab, whether we're the Kasey Bozeman just with some backyard hobby, growing our plants there, we are choosing to help control that reproduction by selectively picking or, selectively breeding for those more desirable traits or characteristics. And so what happens is we know that we can't have a lot of control within selective breeding, but we have two parent plants. As those plants are crossing and those seeds happen, that offspring is to occur, we find those desirable traits that we like. And so, for example, you can see there at the bottom that picture of those Brussels sprouts. And with Brussels sprouts, we have selectively bred for that stem to be really, really tall and long. Those lateral buds, which are the buds on the side of the stem, we have selectively bred so that those leaves stay really small and tight around those lateral buds. And then at the end, that terminal bud has really, really big leaves that really aren't super helpful for human consumption, but we cut off those little Brussels sprouts on the side of that stem and then be able to saute them up. Y'all, I'm from the South. We love some bacon Brussels sprouts. Cook it all down real good, maybe put some balsamic vinegar on it, some sort of like little reduction there. Delicious stuff. So that's essentially what selective breeding is. Now, there are some limitations with selective breeding. You're really dependent on that plant's life cycle. So if it takes, 60 days to, that mature state, it may take 90, it may take 120, kind of depends on the plant, of course. You can't really speed that up, right? Because you're waiting for each cycle to happen. And then within that cycle, you again pull out those characteristics you want, you select them and keep breeding for those desirable characteristics. Of course, it's not 100% perfect. We know that sometimes mutations occur, or even when you're crossing things, you may not always come out with that dominant trait. Some of those recessive things kind of kick in there, but it's really easy to selectively breed. And again, as just a hobby kind of plant grower, I can even selectively breed for different desired characteristics I want in my own plants. Now, genetic engineering or perhaps genetic modification, those GMOs, genetically modified organisms, wrap in that ag community, it's really just people being misinformed, because genetic engineering is simply when we're altering that DNA to produce that more desirable offspring. And I'll tell you, one of the easiest foods to consume is bananas, right? They're relatively low cost. They come in their own little protective covering. You just peel it back, go for it. Great snack to have anytime. But bananas are certainly susceptible to different diseases. And a good example of genetic modifications or genetic engineering is there's actually a sweet pepper. And you can take the genes of a sweet pepper, insert it into a banana plant, and so that those banana fruit have a resistance to this particular disease. And so again, I think sometimes we think of genetic modifications as like, taking the fins of a fish and putting them on like a dolphin, and then taking like the dolphin genes and like putting it in the steak that we eat from the cow kind of thing. That's definitely not what happens at all. And so when we think of what that genetic engineering looks like, it's usually to make that plant give us, higher yields, make them, of course, less the insects, so that they have that ability to not be susceptible to those particular pests that are out there, make them more resistant to some sort of disease. So a lot of cool things that happen with genetic engineering. And so having this background information and then learning about this wild mustard plant, I was sold on we need to educate. And I think that's so important, that with anything we do, it's just to help people understand that we want to be biased towards research. We want to be biased towards accurate information and better helping them understand where our food is coming from. Georgia as a state, I just think of myself in my own role. We have 10 million people that live just in our state alone. And as our population continues to grow and grow, we need to make sure that our food supply, that food chain is certainly healthy. And we do that through great technology that has certainly advanced things. And I'll tell you, I'm going to be one of those that say selective breeding and genetic engineering, go for it. That it is safe, it's healthy for us to do. And we can teach that through these lessons. So our project itself, what we were able to accomplish is that at the national level, National 4-H Council certainly has programs and projects that already exist around food production, around backyard gardens, around things like terrariums, and we've all, sprouted some bean seeds by putting them in the little Ziploc bag and putting them in the window. So we had a lot of resources in place. We never really chose to address plant breeding, biotechnology, some of the concepts that I've already introduced to you today. So in between having these funds and then of course my weird fascination with wild mustard, I was like, this is what we want to make happen. And so we have developed a 6-part series called Appreciating the Power of Plants. And I do believe all of this, the resources, the 6 lesson plans have been shared for you. I'll make sure too, at some point I drop this URL in the chat. I also believe, and we'll double check before we're over with, but these slides have also been made available so you can see all of this that you're watching along with me. But this lesson, or this lesson series itself, excuse me, is all found online, and then there's also PDFs that you can download and use in some sort of offline setting if need be. And so the 6 lessons, you can see what they look like there. We're going to spend a few minutes here just talking through kind of what they look like, what they entail, but know that in a lot of ways it kind of helps to do them in a 6-part series, because you kind of first talk about what is a plant, moving into the parts of a plant, learning about plant genetics and biotechnology. I'm learning about that specific wild mustard there, that Brassica oleracea, and then getting into some greenhouses and apple taste testing and some fun things there. Of course, though, I'm an educator at heart, and so I know sometimes, man, you got an hour program and you can't do it all in an hour for sure, and it may be one of those one and done type experiences, and so they could potentially be standalone lessons as well, whether that's partnering with the library or partnering with a classroom or whatever your role may entail. You could potentially just pick and pull and you use what you need. And so just to let you know, all of the lessons online are kind of structured the same way. And so once you choose one of those 6 lessons, it first gives you a quick about the activity. Again, they're primarily designed for that middle school audience in grades 6 through 8, only because at that level, those students, of course, are going to have a better understanding of genetics in general, and certainly some basic biology when it comes to things like plant reproduction. Like I mentioned, I could easily see this being used for older high school youth as well. And know that I do have some things in the works. We actually piloted an activity just a few weeks ago at 4-H summer camp with high schoolers about plant biotechnology, and would be happy to connect with you offline if you're interested in that resource. But you can see there, all of this looks pretty standard. We would estimate each activity would take about 45 to 60 minutes. I also know, though, if you're doing one activity for 60, 70 kids, it may take a little bit longer because you just have 60 or 70 bodies there that you're trying to facilitate. Fully realizing if you're doing it with a small group of kids, it may go a little bit faster. So all of them are kind of set up and structured in the same way. If you go through the activity, there are different steps. So it's all laid out right there for you. The website version is very interactive and neat. And so that's something that could obviously be hopefully of a benefit, that maybe perhaps regardless of how you're meeting with these students, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in some sort of informal setting, you could easily share the URL. And so as you can see here, it talks about Brassica oleracea is the wild ancestor of many common vegetables. Over a few thousand years, it's been cultivated into these different varieties. And then as you click, so there's that little purple plus arrow there. Once you click onto that, it brings up, here's the kale, and here's a little bit of history about kale coming from the Eastern Mediterranean area and Asia Minor, and talks about it was the modification of the leaves to make them a little bit bigger. And so you can see the 6 different cultivars that we focus on is all there. So very interactive for the students. Now, of course, you too could easily just teach this information without the website. So either way, making it both could be something that's done at a distance, could be something done, in person. It could be a plugged in activity or an unplugged activity. Lots of versatility with what we were able to accomplish. The other thing to know, there's always a test your knowledge section, which is really exciting. Those kind of vary based on the 6 different activities. And so some may be some, kind of multiple choice style questions. This one right here is a crossword puzzle. And so again, if you're doing this plugged in on the internet, you can actually type in the answers. And so the letters populate in the crossword, and then it can be scored for accuracy. And so you can go back and make any modifications if needed, which is really exciting that those results are happening there in real time. And then, like I mentioned too, all of the lessons are a PDF download as well. And so if you wanted to download these activities, this is kind of what one of them looks like, the apple taste testing activity. So they all have a cover there. They have the listing of a quick about the activity, the supplies that you need. That orange sheet is kind of those steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This activity, students get to sample different types of apples. And so it has where they can do an observation worksheet. We're developing great science skills and certainly life skills where we're able to record and observe and describe those experiences that we've had. So all of that's also available as one quick PDF download. And I believe, again, I've already shared all these resources with the wonderful coordinators of this virtual conference. So you should be able to just easily click and access them as well. So before we jump into a quick overview about each of the lessons, I wanted to take a quick pause, mainly to catch my breath and get some water, but wanted to see if anybody had any questions or concerns along the way. I intend for the next couple minutes of our time together for me to talk through those 6 different lessons and kind of explain a little bit more in depth about what they cover, and then give you the opportunity at the end to certainly ask any final questions. All right. So if you do have questions, I know sometimes in the Zoom world, it's a little bit more challenging, but you can feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat section. And I'm very thankful for Michelle to help me get these monitored.
So yes, we do have one question that came in is, okay, what is the website?
Yes. And what I plan to do is at the end, I will pop that into the chat. So I do have that screen pulled up, and hopefully we may have a few minutes to do a quick demo, but I will make sure I get that shared at the end for sure.
Perfect. Then you're
and I know that sounds super perfect. That sounds super needy, but it's easier for me not to share my screen to that part and then have to go back to the PowerPoint, but we'll make sure we get that handled for sure. Easy peasy, friends. Anything else? All right, I told you guys I'm dorking out, trying to be cognizant of time though, so I'd love to share with you real briefly just a quick overview of what these lessons are. If you're like me, you attend virtual experiences and then you kind of file things back in your memory and mind. So I hope that just giving you kind of a quick overview and taste, you'll file it back there, and then one day, whether it's a week from now, a month from now, or years from now, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that thing. And so you'd have that memory there, and hopefully these files still saved so that it can benefit you regardless of what world you play with ag education. So let's go ahead then and dive in. And of course, if you have questions along the way, feel free to pop those in. And I'm very fortunate Michelle's helping me keep those monitored. But the first lesson simply is about plant classification. And so when we think about what plants are, they are these living organisms. Most of them are going to use photosynthesis to make that food in order to survive. We have a few plants that live out there that are more carnivorous in nature, thinking of something like the Venus flytrap or the pitcher plant that actually eats organisms, which is pretty cool stuff. But when we think about beyond just kind of the basics of plants, this, multicellular organism probably uses photosynthesis for food. There's lots of different ways that we further classify and categorize them. And so this lesson itself kind of helps students break down those different classifications. So you have vascular plants that basically are going to use kind of tube-like structures for water to move around, those veins, if you will. Non-vascular plants are going to be things like your mosses that really are more like a sponge. And so that water kind of sloshes all around on the inside. Not very many non-vascular plants exist that are out there, but in the vascular side, tons of plants. So we then further classify those into seeded versus non-seeded or seedless plants. A lot of plants use seeds to reproduce. Some actually use spores instead. A good example of a very common plant is going to be your ferns that are seedless. Instead, they use spores, kind of like a seed, just a little bit different on the inside though. And then when we further break down our seeded plants, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. And so those gymnosperms are going to be those plants that have cones, like a pine tree or a cedar tree, that helps distribute those seeds, where angiosperms are using flowers. And then those could either even be further subdivided into things like monocots and dicots. Those are two fun words to me. Mono meaning one, di meaning two. Cot is short for cotyledon, which is simply the seed leaf. So a good example of a monocot is corn. So when corn starts to grow, it has one seed leaf that first comes up out of the ground. Something like a bean is a dicot. And so if you've ever kind of sprouted bean seeds before, you see two little seed leaves that come up together at the same time. Now, sometimes those leaves are kind of pushed together and kind of work their way up through the soil and then eventually kind of come on out. But that's kind of a cool way just to teach about the variety of plants that exist out there. And with this activity, students kind of learn some of those basic characteristics, and then they have a dichotomous key. I love dichotomous keys. So they're given different examples of plants and then work through that dichotomous key to figure out what it is and some of those characteristics. So great science skills that are being learned in that context of plants. Felt like that was really important to kind of kick us off to know what plants are and how they are structured and some of their key characteristics before we dive into breeding plants to better understand some of those pieces there. So the second lesson talks about the parts of a plant, the six main parts. And again, some plants don't exhibit all of these, but generally speaking, those six main parts working from the ground up are going to be your roots, your stem, your leaves, and then your flowers, your fruits, and your seeds. And so when we think about those different plant parts, the first part of this activity is for students to go out and do some observations of just plants that they see, whether that's looking out an apartment window, whether that's walking around a neighborhood, a schoolyard, whatever that environment is, chances are there's a plant somewhere, and start to kind of put together the pieces of what's the leaf, what's the flower, what's the seed. Sometimes you may not see the roots because they're generally underground, but knowing that they're there and what their function is to provide that support and structure is always super, super helpful. And then we also learn about some of those tricky parts of a plant, like a bulb or a tuber, and then some of the fun debate of fruits and vegetables and what they mean, to then kind of apply these concepts back to a student's everyday life. And so the second part of this activity involves students being able to kind of sketch or draw some of their favorite foods. I always like to do it on paper plates because that makes it a little bit more real and come to life. And then as we start to look at those foods and help identify, oh, okay, so you like to eat, cauliflower, that is actually the flower part of a plant. Or you like to eat tomatoes, that's a fruit. Even though we may think of a tomato as a vegetable, botanically, it's a fruit. Yes, there's times we eat roots. Carrots are very commonly thought of it as the root piece of things. Stem, celery. And so helping them to make some of those connections and better understand where their food comes from. And just because we're eating a plant, we may only eat a specific part of a plant as part of our human consumption. And this too really helps us frame better on down the road when we start to think about selective breeding, how we can selectively breed certain parts of a plant and better understand what that exactly means for that overall organism. So then as we third lesson, this is a really fun, think back to basic Gregor Mendel, Mendelian genetics. He was this monk did a lot of breeding with pea plants. And so Gregor Mendel really helped us determine that genes can be either dominant or recessive. Now we know later on, sometimes you have codominance and sometimes you have where you may have this intermediate experience, and lots of things can happen, but we're going to keep it super basic. Remember, middle school level and what they're able to understand is simply dominant versus recessive. So with this activity, they have a little chart. They're going to get coins, so something very easy. Sometimes you may have those like counting chips in your classroom. I have a ton of those where some little, they're like coin size, but one side's red and one side yellow. Use whatever you got. Don't make it super complicated. Quarters work just as easy though. And so they have different rounds where they flip the coins. Each coin represents that parent plant. Those parent plants are going to come together, have that pollination experience, and then produce that offspring. And so with that, each round, depending on what they flip, heads versus tails, they're going to record that and then determine, was it dominant versus recessive? And then that's going to tell them how to design their corn. So when you design your corn, you could do this as simple as, markers on a piece of paper. I'm one of those people that loves to go big and bold. So when I do this activity with kids, I love to have some styrofoam or even like the cardboard tissue rolls that really help make kind of the body of the corn. We have tissue paper. Thank you. I couldn't think of all that stuff. Tissue paper. We have pipe cleaners. We have beads. We have all sorts of fun things for them to make their corn after they determine all of those characteristics. So are they making a really big corn? Are they making a really small? Are they making it more in that classic kind of oval type shape of the body, or is it going to be more circular? Is the kernel itself very oval, or is it rounded, and what color is it, and things like that? So a lot of cool ways for them to start thinking about how plant genetics happen and occur. And you have that parent generation that's giving us those offspring, which leads us into that concept of selective breeding. And so kind of hard when we think of this middle school level to get super technical. And so with this, to really talk about that wild mustard plant and how it's been selectively bred over time, this is a board game. So kind of similar to Clue in a way. Students have a little checklist that gets printed out, and then they get to start their game piece. And when you think game piece, again, this can be a button, it can be a rock, it can be, a little game piece that you order off of Amazon. Doesn't have to be expensive though. Use what makes most sense for you. You have the 3 different mustard gardens. They get to start in any garden. They first roll a paper dice that has the sun and the clouds on it. And so if it's a sunny day, you get to leave your garden. If it's a cloudy, rainy day, you can't. And then they roll the second dice if they have the sunny day. And that tells them the number of spaces. They move around the garden so that they visit all of the different mustard cultivars. So they have to go to the 6 other gardens, just like Clue. You kind of enter and exit at certain places. Some gardens have more entrances and exits than others. There's also a fun little tunnel dug throughout the area where they can go under the gardens and move around. So a lot of fun, just games, teamwork, and a fun way to teach these concepts. Lesson number 5 deals with engineering a greenhouse, and we know science and engineering are heavily connected. We use that acronym STEM all the time, and so I'm really excited that we've pulled in an engineering component. This lesson talks a little bit about the history of greenhouses, originally used to grow tropical plants in Europe. Greenhouses were originally called orangeries, which is really cool because they were growing oranges. But today, the modern greenhouse is used for a variety of reasons, including plant breeding and certainly this plant biotechnology that we talk about. So similar to paper dolls, all of the students get paper plants, and you can see the example there, blueberries. I know I live in the peach state, but we actually produce more blueberries than peaches. They are a great crop for us here in hot, sandy South Georgia, but we have a variety of different crops that the kids can choose. They kind of make that little paper plant, and then from there, they can use a variety of materials you provide, popsicle sticks, saran wrap, wax paper, pipe cleaners, hot glue, whatever you choose. There's no really right or wrong way to do this. And then they engineer a greenhouse. Following that engineering design process, we give them some examples. Do they want that tunnel version, that A-frame, that gable, whatever works best for them. But getting them to think through how do you build a greenhouse in such a way that it's able to like let in light, but also allow your plant to grow, and think through some of those real world applicabilities, which is really cool. And then last but not least, our final activity, got to do something to get them excited about the tasting process. And so apples are some of the foods that are very common that have been selectively bred, and certainly this idea of plant biotechnology using with them over time. And so you can get different varieties of apple. We have a few suggestions in there, and students can sample those apples and then write down things like the fruit color, the skin color. You can see all the characteristics there. And so that just gives you kind of a quick overview of the lessons. And I think, Michelle, you back to give me my 5-minute warning?
Yes, I am.
Excellent, excellent. So we have found a lot of success with these. Again, something that kind of emerged at the beginning of the pandemic, and as we have continued to be creative with our programming. In summer of 2021, we were able to pilot some of these activities during camp, and you can see we've built some greenhouses, we played some board games, and hopefully had students learn a lot along the way. Like I mentioned, do more work around high school level activities. Want to make sure you want to connect offline. Happy to share those with you, but I'm curious if this is anything that you're interested in or could find ways to use this in your own programs. I realize we have a lot of representation here and a lot of folks that do a lot of different things, but certainly want to use these last couple minutes for questions and comments along the way. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen, and then I will be sure to put the link there in the chat box for the presentation. If you'll give me just a few, or for the lesson plans, I'm sorry. I'll get that pulled up real quick.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kasey. If we have any questions, feel free to drop them in the question and answer. And as Kasey drops that in, I just want to take a second to thank you again for your outstanding presentation. And thank you to our viewers for dropping by. We're certain that you enjoyed this as much as I did. We've got a few more minutes here before we close out this session, and know that our next secondary session will start at the top of the hour. So if good question. We just had somebody drop in that are these lessons available through the National Ag in the Classroom Curriculum Matrix? And I believe they are not at this time, that it's specifically connected to the 4-H program itself.
That is correct. But I don't know how to have that conversation, but if there's a way to have those conversations and get them there, I can double check, but I don't see why that would be an issue, because we want as many people as possible to use these. So I did throw the link to the chat, or the link to the website, I apologize, in the chat. And then you can see what it kind of looks like here. And then as you just scroll down, you'll see each of the lessons right here, and you click view the activity. And it brings up that activity, and you can scroll. And then eventually you get to kind of towards the end, and there's that download button that downloads the entire activity as one big PDF, which is super nice. And then you can go back and find that next activity and kind of keep clicking down. So that one main link that I shared has all 6 there for you.
Great. Do we have any more questions coming in for Kasey?
Big science plant dork, but love to talk about these things. Everything should be there again as you explore the virtual site. I'm also one though that you got to have those hard copies every now and then. So feel free to go ahead and download those activities so that you do have them. But I think we did a really nice job too. Activity steps 5, print out this guide chart. So we've relinked it there for you. It's also up here in the supply section. So trying to make it as simple and easy as possible. I know what it's like to be an educator, and we just want you to use these resources. So anything we can do to make it easier or suggestions, we certainly welcome those and would love to hear from you. Any other final questions?
I think that's it. Between our behind the scenes people and ourselves, we've been able to answer those out. So again, I just wanted to take a second to thank Kasey for her time and her presentation. Know that we are going to wrap this one up. It will be recorded, and it is recorded and available for future watch in the next week or so through the National Ag in the Classroom program. And our next presentation will begin promptly on the hour. You can watch